much. It's an honor to be here. I am joined with two esteemed panelists. To my left is my Ganesh, who's a PhD student at Leuphana University. And to my right is Eva Galperin, who is the Director of Cybersecurity for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Is that better? Okay, we're there. Excellent. Today we are going to be discussing a topic that's quite close to my heart. As mentioned, I kind of consider myself a tech ethicist. I made up the title, so I get to say what it is or what it's not, I guess in some ways. But I'm quite interested about the intersection of technology and the idea of how technologically mediated experiences are shaping human connections. What I'm going to be talking about today is ID systems, identification systems, both at the national level, but in the ways in which that corporations are also attaining a level of what was once the exclusive domain of the nation state in giving individuals a unique identifier that in one way triangulates and creates an identity, but the ways in which that those identities that are created for us influence our agency. So, taking a look at the way that other industries are regulated, we have a notion of critical infrastructure. In Germany, for instance, the critical infrastructure sectors are transport and traffic, energy, information technology and telecommunications, finance and insurance, state and administration, food, water, health, and media and culture. But there's not a carve-out for things like large databases involving personal information. So that's the gist of what we're discussing today is what does it mean when we are entering into a system in which that our IDs are tied to our human bodies, but also are able to aggregate information from our online behavior and even things like biometrics. So, that being said, I'm going to start with a quote from Brian Larkin, who says, "Infrastructure is things, but it's also the relations between things." And beginning, maybe we'll start on the corporate side of things. Taking a company like Facebook with now 2 billion users. This is larger than the population of any one country. And based in the US, but we've seen with Cambridge Analytica and other services, other companies in which that the way that the identity that we have created by Facebook is also able to influence our agency, whether it's voting habits or advertisements. And so I think on that, thinking about the ways in which that data has kind of different models, whether in the corporate world or in the nation state, turn it over to start with Maya, and I guess my question for you is: do you see a large distinction between a company like Facebook having a unique identifier for 2 billion people and a nation state having a national ID registry?
Okay, so I think that there's definitely two different models. If you have Facebook as a repository of data versus a nation state starting from kind of rights and responsibilities, the fact that we elect our governments in most places and I think there's different sorts of social, political contracts that we have with the nation state, and I think when with our governments, and then when we have corporate infrastructures that are managing our data, there's a very different kind of relationship. Now you can have sort of a Euro-American corporate model, which is quite different from the Chinese model, for example, which is still sort of its own kind of version or brand of capitalism, but you also have the government that's doing that. So you have sort of the centralized idea of control in these kinds of places, whereas in other places there may be a more corporate competitive notion. I think in the Indian context of something like Aadhaar, you've got a public-private partnership going on where you have the government has instituted a unique identification project, but with sort of corporate vendors. And the man who kind of actually runs, or is the architect of the Aadhaar project in India, is also the CEO and one of the founders of Infosys, which is a huge, big IT company. So I think you've got like definitely these distinct models going on, and thinking now at this point about what does that mean for how our infrastructure is governed is, I mean, we should have actually been doing it a little while ago. We only tend to think about infrastructure when it breaks down, and good infrastructure is invisible. So now that we're seeing lots of crises and breakdowns, definitely in the Aadhaar context. But I think the other thing that's also interesting to think about is who's responsible for all of the old or legacy infrastructures that newer big data infrastructures interface with. So in the context of something like Aadhaar, I was just looking, I don't have an Aadhaar card, obviously, but if I wanted to, what would the steps be? And I hadn't actually investigated any of that. So I kind of looked online at how I might do that, and then tried to count all of the different kinds of legacy or older analog or partially digitized state infrastructures that I'd need to interface with if I got an Aadhaar card, from being able to register online, to getting something in the post, to, I mean, we think about the biometrics as the biggest part of it, but then going to a center, standing in line, waiting, getting a two-factor authentication on your phone when your Aadhaar card is ready. There's a whole list of reasons why you cannot get the one-time password on your phone, which is very unique to India, you know, and the mobile networks there. So there's a lot of multiple infrastructural systems interfacing there.
So I think that's a really nice overview of where we are now. And I think maybe going back a little bit, Eva, could you describe in some ways, give us a quick brief of like maybe how we got here? What are we know kind of on the nation state side that governments have given their citizens IDs, but as we see the rise in corporations also being a vector of identification, what have the last maybe 20 years of the rise of the internet and other technologies, and before Facebook, maybe you could share a little bit about kind of how, what was the tradition that perhaps kind of the path dependency that got us here?
All right. It helps if I turn this thing on. It's on? Okay, good. In that case, well, to begin with, the whole idea of a singular digital identity that you have across the internet did not start with Facebook. This has been a dream that middle-aged white men in Silicon Valley have had for a very long time. And it goes back to a whole bunch of different proposals for, you know, singular identity systems or singular logons that you would use for absolutely everything in your digital life. And pretty much all of them ended in disaster or simply failed to take off. And one of the reasons was that it required a lot of buy-in from all of the other you know, from basically all of the other, you know, digital things that you might sign into on the internet. So it never really went anywhere. The reason that we talk about Facebook so much is because now you can use Facebook to sign into so many other services. And it's become the closest thing that we have to an internet-wide identity. And that is extremely problematic because Facebook's policies then have this ripple effect that goes well beyond Facebook and the other companies that it owns. And it means that if your Facebook account is frozen or taken away for some reason, like perhaps you are not using your real name, or maybe you are a political activist and you have been targeted by your government and they have reported that your account is posting underage porn, which is a thing that has happened to Vietnamese activists quite often, then suddenly you don't just lose access to Facebook, you lose access to everything else that you were using your Facebook account to log into. And that is intensely problematic. Furthermore, we're not just using our Facebook accounts to post pictures of cats and get invited to parties and communicate with our friends. For example, using Facebook is part of my job. EFF has a Facebook account, and I understand that a lot of people who are engaged in privacy and security activism say, well, just don't use Facebook. And I say, well, good luck doing activism, reaching out to people without Facebook. Activists go where the people are, and then we try to change the policies there. If we're not there, the chances that we're going to be able to do much and have them listen to us are much, much lower. So if my Facebook account gets taken away, I suddenly can't do my job. I cannot post to the EFF Facebook. Likewise, if my Twitter account gets frozen, I will have difficulty posting to the EFF Twitter. So these are the kinds of problems that we have, and they go way beyond just this sort of harmless socialization, which is the way that Mark Zuckerberg often likes to characterize Facebook interactions.
So, I mean, I think that makes a persuasive case how a private company, an unelected private company that operates across the globe, now is able to instill privileges in ways that extend far beyond the boundaries of the platform itself. You said at the point that good infrastructure is invisible, that we don't notice a bridge until it perhaps collapses. We don't notice a road until there's a pothole. We have this kind of routine. If we kind of have a metaphor for sort of the ability for us to operate in our lives, to exercise our agency based on our identity, and to think about this metaphor of transportation, of personal transportation. I think there's a few different modes of transportation, each that have different sort of regulatory environments around them. Personal vehicles, cars, at least now while people drive them, insurance is mandatory in most jurisdictions. There's car crash testing for that vehicle to ever be on the road. Same thing with buses, there are special licenses you have to drive, and even with airplanes in order to have kind of spot checks. And so in the kind of personal transportation, in the transportation sector, there's I don't know, stress tests, and there's other sort of testings and regulation requirements in order to make sure that these modes of transportation are safe. Do you see any of that same sort of design thinking being brought into either the national ID systems, whether it's Estonia and e-governance, where everyone has a card, but also it was found to have a chipset vulnerability. The India example of perhaps people being able to buy personal information through WhatsApp groups. Where do you think should be the onus on? Should it be the holders of these databases? Should it be regulators that make sure that no one amasses too much information? From the transportation example, what are your thoughts on?
I think like a car is really different from an aeroplane, obviously, and a bridge is different from a road, and we're talking about very different engineering cultures that make these infrastructures possible and how they're owned and what they're about. If we think about data as infrastructure, then it's not just the data itself, but data is also infrastructure for other industries. So, and data itself needs its own infrastructure, and I think that when you have kind of older industries like cars, planes, trains, automobiles, you have a long legacy of engineering and regulation kind of evolving and actually one producing the other over time. So there's been a history of testing these things. Of course, with things like cars, it's different. I mean, you have a personal model of ownership, but at the same time, there's also your responsibility to people like pedestrians, to laws which are maybe, and regulations which are local. Planes are really different. High-end engineering is totally different. I mean, like, there's a reason why aviation engineering is really kind of top of the line, though I've looked into this a little bit in some of my work, and actually it's kind of scary when you look at how it's not about the test, but it's the performance of the test and regulations. So because a plane is, well, first class and economy go down at the same time if there's a problem. But while that's there, I think that, and everybody's data gets released at the same time, you know, when you're on the same database. So I think those metaphors are kind of useful, but I think the proof is always in like which metaphor works and who wants to take it on and who wants to be responsible for instituting that. If we had a little bit of care, actually treating data as something else. I'm not saying that it has to be aviations or automobiles, because these are also quite specific things, then maybe there just needs to be that greater level of care and multiple systems working together, which I don't think we have now. You just have kind of, you know, Facebook a sort of kingdom unto itself, or the companies that own Equifax, or, you know, it's definitely in the Indian context, we do not have enough security with the database infrastructure that exists. It's not seen as critical infrastructure.
I actually have one quick thing to add from earlier today. So earlier today, Twitter pushed an update to all of its users saying that as a result of a vulnerability and mistake in its systems, it had accidentally stored everyone's passwords in clear text somewhere in a log. So they couldn't be sure how many, they couldn't be sure for how long, and so they simply went ahead and notified everybody and said, hey, everybody, change your password. If you're also using this password on some other site, please change that password as well. And they added one interesting and sort of smug bit at the end, which was, we didn't have to tell you this. And it's true. They absolutely don't have to tell you this. Doing security at a large company is a little bit like, how many of you have seen Men in Black? Many of you have seen Men in Black. So at the end of Men in Black, the Men in Black are informed that there is some sort of new terrible threat about to destroy the world and that they need to get going. And one of them turns to the other and says, there's always an Attilian battle cruiser getting ready to destroy the Earth. That's what security engineering is like. There's always something terrible like this, and most of the way that we get through our lives is that the companies don't tell us, which is extremely chilling.
Yeah. No, and I think in the Indian case, the problem has been that there's been a number of journalistic accounts, but also kind of security accounts about how the infrastructure is absolutely not safe and can be compromised, but they're never willing to acknowledge it, because that would acknowledge like a failure on a monumental scale. I mean, money aside, just what it means to set up a database or infrastructure like this is heroic, for sure. But then there is a lot of this kind of heroism, hero narratives in kind of setting up infrastructure like this. I mean, all big infrastructure when it starts is about that slightly fantastical imaginary of, oh my God, we can do this, 1 billion people and their biometrics, you know? So yeah, but there be dragons too, so.
And if anyone is around for the next session, I'll be speaking with Adam Harvey about biometrics. So we haven't touched on that so much, but I think that one of the kind of the points around biometrics is these kind of immutable characteristics that we have, our faces, that we, once they're in the wild, once they've been captured, we can't just change our face. We can't just, we have these characteristics. I mean, there's voice print technology and these other things. And so the quantification, or the quantified life that we're seeing more and more of, with more actors around the world at different levels, trying to encapsulate us in a particular, give us assign us a unique ID, aggregate characteristics on that, and then try to kind of exploit us in some ways, whether that's trying to sell things or, especially in the corporate world. But I mean, I think that breaches are inevitable now. That if it hasn't been hacked, it's probably just a matter of time. Some of the most sensitive U.S. government data from the Office of Personnel Management was hacked. The kind of everybody that had applied for a security clearance. So, if the entities which have the most funding are still vulnerable, what does that mean for small companies that are collecting incredibly personal data, have a business model, and then sell to other companies, and then are able to continue to aggregate information about us that we don't even know exists? And so with that, we have a few minutes left. I open up to both of y'all for kind of a closing statement, if you'd like, and then I think we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anybody wants to ask a question.
All right, I figured I would start by finish by talking a little bit about all of the databases that we are entered into involuntarily, and all of the systems that we take part in, often without even knowing, or even though we have chosen to check out of them. For example, in the United States, there is a credit rating system called Equifax, and Equifax was hacked I think it was last year, and a lot of people had extremely sensitive data about their credit history leaked, which made it possible to steal their identities and pretend to be them and spend their money and all kinds of other things. And all that Equifax offered these many people as a sort of as reparations for this incredible breach of their privacy is credit monitoring. So if somebody steals your credit card or tries to steal their identity, like, well, keep an eye out. Well, the horse has already left the barn. It's a bit late at that point. The other systems I wanted to talk about quick were OPM, where everybody who wanted to work for the government and needed to get a security clearance was required to have a series of interviews and this very long list of extremely personal things. We're all living in this database. All of the U.S. potential spies, for example, were burned in the OPM hack. Oh, I had one more like strange and involuntary database. Oh yes.
Is it Korea?
North Korea required its bloggers to register all of their social media accounts under their real names, and it was kept in a database in South Korea, which was run by the government. So this information was not publicly available until they were hacked, and that information was made publicly available, and that was incredibly damaging. Not to mention that further down the line, a lawyer got the entire law ruled to be unconstitutional in the first place. But certainly the hack helped to make the argument that this was a terrible idea. So if other people come to you and they say, oh, but if only the government knows who all of the anonymous users of the internet are, nothing will go wrong, that's the thing to point them to. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about were Facebook shadow profiles. So it is very common among, again, activists, people in Europe, people who are concerned about their privacy and their security, to go, well, I'm just not going to use Facebook. Well, I have news for you. You still have a Facebook profile. Even if you have chosen not to participate in the system, you are participating in the system, and Facebook has information about you, which a lot of people find extremely worrying. And it's not like you can get it taken down. You can't write to Facebook and say, erase my shadow profile. It's simply not possible. And on that cheerful note,
well, I actually, the thing that I want to end with on the Aadhaar story is that maybe there is some hope in the court system that we have. The Indian Supreme Court has been actually doing an amazing job recently, and in August, at the end of August last year, we had for the first time a ruling on privacy, and the fact that we have privacy, we have a right to privacy. Before that, we kind of didn't. But now we have a right to privacy, and this was the time at which the Aadhaar story was sort of kicking off in lots of ways. So today, or yesterday, was actually day 36 of the Aadhaar hearing, which was basically the hearing about how does the right to privacy sit alongside all of the violations of the Aadhaar database, the fact that you have to link, we're supposed to link our Aadhaar cards with our income tax returns, with our bank accounts. Many people don't want to do that, and this is being argued in court right now. And I'm really pleased that the court is taking it up very seriously. And this is not the case in a whole lot of other places, but I think that if we had I think it's a very unique moment in India. So it's literally, many of us, I think, get emails from our bank saying, where's your Aadhaar card? You have to link your account to your Aadhaar card. Now all I'm doing is looking at this one amazing Twitter account that is constantly tweeting from the Supreme Court of India about what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So I'm just holding out till then, basically.
Can you tell us which Twitter account that is?
Yeah, it's at Gautam Bhatia 88, Gautam Bhatia 88. He is amazing. He's a Supreme Court lawyer, and he has the most amazing documentation of everything that's happening in the Supreme Court on the Aadhaar and privacy ruling. So, yeah, thanks.
Do we have a time? 1 minute? Okay. Well, I'm sorry. If you catch us later, we'd love to chat. I think just in the last minute, this was quite a quick session. A lot of things to cover. Leaving here, I would encourage that we all, as activists and academics, researchers, journalists, whatever our role is, that if we are able to think outside the box, think about other regulatory regimes that are applied to other sectors and industries, and start thinking about how can we conceptualize in a holistic manner the notion in which that we will have identity numbers placed upon us, but whether it's our online activity, whether it's our IRL activity, that we're not just one person. One single indicator can't define who we are. And if these boxes that are placed on us as humans, I believe, left unchecked, will eventually erode our agency and diminish our capacity for human flourishing. And so as we think about the 21st century and how important access to things are just from holding an ID, a particular sort of identification, I really think that we need to have think about a global regulatory regime, especially in the day and age in which data passes around the world every moment. So I encourage everybody to think about this topic more. What are the ways in which that national IDs and other IDs are perhaps a layer of critical social infrastructure? Thank you all very much.